Imagine standing in a stadium with 80,000 people screaming your name. The lights are blinding. The ground shakes beneath your feet. The entire weight of a city rests on your shoulders. And somewhere inside your chest, an invisible hand is squeezing your lungs. You cannot breathe. Not really. Not the way normal people breathe. Every single inhale is a negotiation with your own body. Every exhale is a victory you have to earn. Now imagine that this has been your entire life. Not just tonight. Not just this season. Since you were a little boy lying awake in a dark bedroom in Detroit, gasping, praying, wondering if this would be the night your body finally gave up on you. And despite all of that, despite every doctor's doubt, every coach's cold stare, every front office decision that said you were not the right fit, not fast enough, not built for this, you still ran. You ran through broken lungs. You ran through torn muscles and sleepless mornings. You ran through the kind of shame that only comes when you fumble the ball in the most important game of your life, in front of the world, and have to decide in that single devastating moment whether you are done or not. This is not a story about a football player who won a Super Bowl. This is the story of a man who should never have made it, who had every reason to stop, whose body tried to stop him at every single stage, but who never, not once, accepted that as the final answer. And what you are about to hear will completely change how you see resilience, how you see pressure, and how you see what a human being is truly capable of enduring. Jerome Bettis, the bus, the man Detroit made, the man who carried an entire city on his back while barely being able to carry enough air in his chest. This is his real story, and it is far more painful, far more shocking, and far more powerful than anything you have ever read in a highlight reel. Jerome Bettis was not born into easy circumstances. He grew up in the streets of Detroit, Michigan, a city known for its grit, its hustle, its refusal to be counted out. And in a neighborhood like that, weakness was not something you could afford to show. The world around him demanded toughness. It demanded that you keep your head up, keep moving, keep going no matter what hit you. But Jerome had a secret that made all of that terrifyingly complicated. He had asthma. Severe, unpredictable, life-threatening asthma. And for a boy growing up in a world that rewarded strength, carrying that condition was not just a medical inconvenience. It was a source of deep, quiet terror. The attacks came without warning. One moment he was fine, and the next, the air simply stopped coming. His chest would tighten like someone had wrapped a steel cable around it and was pulling both ends. His breathing would turn into a ragged, desperate scraping sound, like his lungs were trying to work through a blocked drain. There were nights, long dark nights in that Detroit house, when Jerome would lie awake wondering if he was going to make it to morning. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, terrifying way that only someone who has experienced a true asthma attack can understand. When your body is telling you it cannot do this anymore, and you are a child, and you are alone in the dark, and you do not know if help will come in time. His mother understood. She watched him like a hawk, monitoring every breath, every cough, every change in his color. She controlled everything she could, his environment, his schedule, what he ate, where he went. She was trying to keep him alive in the most literal sense of the word. His father took a different approach, pushing Jerome to not let the condition define him, to find discipline and mental toughness as a counterweight to physical limitation. And caught between those two forces, between a mother's protective fear and a father's demanding resilience, Jerome grew up with something building inside him. Not confidence, not yet, but something harder, a stubbornness, a refusal to be stopped by the thing that his body kept throwing at him. And yet, even with that stubbornness forming, the gap between Jerome and other kids was impossible to ignore. He would stand on the sidelines watching them run and jump and play without thinking twice about the air filling their lungs. Simple things, natural things, things that cost them nothing. And he would be calculating, can I keep up today? Will my body let me do this? What happens if I push too hard and the attack comes out here, in front of everyone? That gap was not just physical. It became something that lived in his soul. The understanding that the simplest gifts other people took for granted were things he had to fight for, plan around, and occasionally grieve. There is a specific kind of loneliness in having an invisible illness. Nobody can see it until the moment it takes you down. And so for most of his childhood, Jerome carried his condition in silence, unable to fully explain to friends what it felt like, unable to make coaches understand why he sometimes held back, unable to escape the quiet sadness of knowing he was different in a way that no one around him could truly see. But here is what nobody talks about when they tell the Jerome Bettis story. They talk about his accomplishments. They talk about the yards and the Pro Bowls and the Super Bowl ring. What they almost never talk about is the physical reality of what asthma does to an athlete day after day, year after year, at the highest level of professional sport. Asthma is not something that politely steps aside when you reach the NFL. It does not look at your contract and decide to take a vacation. It follows you into every training camp, onto every practice field, into every game on every Sunday. There were moments during games, real games, regular season and playoffs, when Jerome Bettis was running through a defense while his chest was seizing, while the air in his lungs was becoming more precious, more restricted with every collision, while his body was doing the exact opposite of what you need a body to do when you are trying to gain yards against the best defensive players on the planet. And he did it anyway. He kept running, not because he felt fine, because he had decided a long time ago that feeling fine was a luxury he could not wait for. Every game carried risk in a way that most players never experienced. Most players worry about being tackled, about their knees, about concussions. Jerome worried about all of that, and also about whether his bronchial tubes were going to cooperate for the next 4 quarters. That is a level of physical warfare that almost no one in the history of professional football has ever had to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. On the field against the opposition, and inside his own body against himself. And he did it for over a decade, through 13,000 rushing yards, through 6 Pro Bowl selections, through an entire era of Pittsburgh Steelers football. The asthma was always there. Quiet sometimes, loud sometimes, but always present, always a factor. Always a reminder that nothing Jerome Bettis achieved was ever truly free. And then there was his body type. This is another layer of the story that people mention briefly but rarely dig into, because it cuts to something uncomfortable. Jerome Bettis did not look like what coaches imagined when they drew up their dream running back on a whiteboard. He was heavy. He was not particularly fast. In a sport that increasingly worshipped speed, that prized the player who could take a handoff and disappear around the corner in a blur, Jerome was the opposite. He was the player who ran at you, through you, over you if necessary, but never around you. And in the modern NFL, that style was supposed to be dying. Scouts looked at him and saw limitations before they saw potential. Coaches designed systems that did not naturally accommodate what he was. And throughout his career, from high school to college to the pros, Jerome Bettis had to fight a perception problem on top of every physical challenge he already faced. He was not what they were looking for. He was not the mold they wanted to fill. And that judgment, repeated enough times, delivered in enough different ways, has a cumulative effect on a person. It starts to burrow in. It starts to make you wonder whether the people who doubt you might be right. Whether you are trying to fit yourself into a story that was never written for you. There were training sessions at Notre Dame where Jerome worked twice as hard as everyone around him just to earn half the attention. Not because he lacked effort, but because effort alone could not change the way evaluating eyes looked at his frame, his speed, his fit in their vision of what a great player was supposed to be. And each time he was passed over, each time a decision placed him lower on the depth chart, it required him to make a choice. To absorb that judgment and let it settle into belief, or to refuse it. To keep moving, to keep proving, without any guarantee that anyone was watching or cared. By the time Jerome Bettis reached the NFL draft and was selected by the Los Angeles Rams, he had already spent years building a foundation not of confidence, but of endurance. He had learned to exist in environments that were not designed for him. He had learned to function despite pain, despite doubt, despite the kind of slow accumulation of other people's low expectations that would have broken most people entirely. And then in his very first NFL season, he did something stunning. He gained over 1,000 rushing yards. He was explosive in ways that defied what scouts had projected. He won the Offensive Rookie of the Year award. For the first time in his life, the world was saying his name in a positive way without an asterisk, without a qualifier, without a but. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like maybe the hardest part was behind him. But professional football is not a place that offers extended peace. Because behind the numbers and the recognition, there was a structural problem that was going to end very badly for Jerome Bettis, and he had no control over it. The Los Angeles Rams system was not built around what he did best. They wanted speed. They wanted quickness. They wanted the kind of offensive versatility that came from a back who could make defenders miss in space. Jerome was not that player. He was a power runner, a grinder, someone who needed the right scheme and the right philosophy around him to function at his ceiling. And when the Rams decided he was not their future, when they made the cold, clinical decision to trade him away despite everything he had just proven, it confirmed something that Jerome had always feared at the deepest level. That success was not the same as security. That proving yourself was not the same as belonging. That in this business, you could do everything right and still be moved like a piece on a board that someone else was playing. Being traded is not just a change of address in the NFL. It is a statement about your value. It is an organization saying, in the plainest possible terms, that whatever you are, it is not exactly what we need. And for a person who had spent his entire life fighting to be seen as enough, that message did not land lightly. There were days after that trade announcement where Jerome Bettis had to sit with a question that had no comfortable answer. If that was not enough, then what was? And then Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh Steelers. A franchise built on a culture that matched Jerome Bettis in a way the Los Angeles Rams never had. In Pittsburgh, power was not a limitation. It was the identity, the steel curtain, the black and gold. A city that understood what it meant to grind, to work, to absorb punishment, and keep going. For the first time in his professional career, Jerome stepped into an environment where who he actually was, not who coaches wished he could be, was exactly what was needed. And the transformation was not overnight. He still had to rebuild trust. He still had to prove himself to a new coaching staff, new teammates, new fans. He still carried the physical burden of asthma and the accumulating weight of years of hard contact. But gradually, something started to shift. Not in the world's perception of him first, in his own perception of himself. He stopped trying to run away from his identity as a power back and started owning it completely. The heaviness that scouts had criticized became the very thing that made him almost impossible to stop once he got moving. The nickname "the bus" stopped being a casual observation and started being the most accurate description of what happened to anyone who tried to get in his way. And his teammates saw it. His coaches saw it. The city of Pittsburgh saw it. Jerome Bettis became not just a player, but a symbol. The kind of player whose presence in the huddle made everyone around him believe they could sustain a drive, could punch through a defense, could win the physical battle that every game in Pittsburgh required. He was selected to the Pro Bowl 6 times during his career. He became one of the most recognized and respected running backs of his generation. From the outside, it looked like Jerome Bettis had finally arrived. Like the struggle was over. But inside that body, inside that mind that had spent decades learning to endure, the struggle was never over. It just took different forms. Every morning in Pittsburgh was a negotiation. Jerome would wake up and his body would take inventory of itself, cataloging every collision from the game before, every bruise that had deepened overnight, every joint that was moving slightly wrong. The asthma was still there. The wear from years of NFL contact was building. There were days where simply getting out of bed was its own quiet achievement, unreported, uncelebrated, but entirely real. After games, when the stadium emptied and the fans went home replaying the highlights in their minds, Jerome would step into a different reality. A reality of ice baths and treatment rooms and bodies that hurt in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has never played professional football for a decade. The accumulated damage of a career like his does not reset between seasons. It compounds. It stacks. Each year adds to what came before. And Jerome carried all of it forward, game after game, season after season, without once walking onto the field and telling his team he needed to stop. This is what the injury report does not capture. This is what the statistics do not show. The story of what it costs a human body to produce those 13,000 yards over that many seasons, in that style of play, with a respiratory condition working against it from the inside. And yet the story that most people know best from Jerome Bettis' career is not about asthma and not about the body. It is about one single play. One devastating, defining, career-threatening moment that happened in a January 2006 playoff game. And it is a moment that reveals everything about who Jerome Bettis truly was. The Pittsburgh Steelers were in the AFC divisional playoff against the Indianapolis Colts. The Steelers had the lead. They were controlling the game. And Jerome Bettis, the veteran presence, the man the team trusted in exactly these moments, took a handoff near the goal line. All he needed to do was protect the ball. Push forward. Secure the position. Simple. The kind of thing he had done thousands of times. And then the ball came out. A fumble. Right there, at the worst possible moment, in the most important game of the season, with the entire outcome of the game suddenly hanging on whether Indianapolis could recover that loose football and drive the other way for a score. Jerome Bettis stood there in that moment and felt the weight of everything he had ever feared collapse on top of him all at once. Every doubt anyone had ever expressed about him. Every time he had wondered if he was enough. Every quiet fear that one day, in one moment, he would be the reason everything fell apart. It all arrived simultaneously, in the second that ball hit the turf. And the cruelest part was that he had no way to fix it. No way to reach back and undo what had just happened. The play existed. The mistake existed. The entire stadium and the entire country watching on television had just seen Jerome Bettis, the bus, the most reliable presence on the Pittsburgh Steelers, fumble the football in the playoffs. The Colts recovered. They had a chance to win the game. Indianapolis kicker Mike Vanderyacht lined up for a field goal that would have sent the Steelers home. And in one of the most stunning moments in recent NFL playoff history, Vanderyacht missed. Wide right. The Steelers survived. They won the game. Jerome Bettis did not lose Pittsburgh the season in that moment. But what happened inside him when that ball hit the ground? That was something the scoreboard could never record and the final score could never erase. Because a mistake like that does not go away just because the outcome worked out. It lives. It replays. It becomes the thing your mind returns to at 3 a.m. when you cannot sleep. And for a man who had spent his entire life building walls against the fear of not being enough, that fumble was not just a mistake. It was a test of whether everything he had built could survive the worst version of himself, showing up at the worst possible time. He did not hide from it. He could not. The cameras caught everything. The microphones found him. The sports world had opinions. And Jerome Bettis sat inside all of that, the noise, the second-guessing, the weight of a moment he could not change. And he had to decide what came next. Not what to say in a press conference. Not how to manage the media narrative. He had to decide, in the privacy of his own mind, whether he was going to let that moment define him or not. And this is where Jerome Bettis, after everything, the asthma, the trade, the body that was always fighting against him, the years of proving himself in environments where he did not belong, this is where all of that preparation finally made its meaning clear. Because a person who had never lived through genuine adversity might have been destroyed by that fumble. But Jerome had been preparing for moments exactly like this his entire life. Not consciously, not intentionally, but every time he had gotten up off a practice field when his lungs were refusing to cooperate, every time he had come back after being told he was not what they were looking for, every time he had absorbed a collision that most people would not have gotten up from, all of it had been training for this. Not for football, for life, for the ability to face the worst moment and still choose to keep going. And so he went to Super Bowl 40. The Pittsburgh Steelers made the run. They kept winning. And the Super Bowl that year was held in Detroit, Michigan, Jerome Bettis' hometown, the city where he had grown up gasping for air in dark bedrooms, the city where he had first discovered that his body was not going to cooperate with his dreams, the place where everything had started. And now the biggest game of his career, possibly the last game of his career, was going to be played there, in front of his family, in front of the people who had known him before any of this, in front of the city that had shaped him. The weight of that is almost impossible to overstate, because when you return to the place where you started, nothing is abstract anymore. Every memory is present. Every version of yourself you have ever been is watching. And Jerome Bettis stood in Detroit for Super Bowl 40 as a living, breathing answer to every doubt that had ever been expressed about him. He was there. After everything, he was still there. The Pittsburgh Steelers defeated the Seattle Seahawks in Super Bowl 40. Jerome Bettis won the championship. And when it was over, when the confetti fell in a stadium in his own hometown, he announced his retirement. He did not do it because he had to. He did it because the story had found its ending. because he had gone all the way back to where it started and had closed the circle in the only way that could have made it complete. He retired as a Pittsburgh Steeler, a Pro Football Hall of Famer, one of the greatest running backs in the history of the sport, with more than 13,000 rushing yards, 6 Pro Bowl appearances, and a Super Bowl ring earned in the city of Detroit. But the truest measure of Jerome Bettis is not in any of those numbers. The truest measure is in the things that never appeared on a stat sheet. It is in the childhood nights when he chose to keep breathing even when his body made it feel optional. It is in the practice sessions at Notre Dame where he worked twice as hard for half the recognition. It is in the quiet of a locker room in Los Angeles after learning he had been traded and deciding that was not the ending. It is in the mornings in Pittsburgh when he got out of bed before the pain had finished its inventory of his body and went to practice anyway. It is in the seconds after a fumble when the whole world was watching and every fear he had ever carried arrived at once, and he decided to still be there the next morning. Jerome Bettis never had perfect lungs. He never had the ideal body type. He was never the fastest player on the field. He was never the player that coaches drew on a whiteboard when they imagined their ideal running back. He was something more difficult and more valuable than all of that. He was the player who refused to not be there, who refused to let his story be written by the people who looked at him and saw limitation instead of will. He was the player who turned every single disadvantage into proof that determination is its own kind of talent. And perhaps the most shocking truth of his entire story is not that he overcame asthma, not that he survived being traded, not even that he fumbled in the playoffs and somehow went on to win a Super Bowl in his hometown. The most shocking truth is that almost none of it should have been possible by any conventional measure. By conventional measure, Jerome Bettis should have been a cautionary tale. A kid from Detroit with asthma and the wrong body type who almost made it, but did not quite get there. Instead, he became the bus. He became a Hall of Famer. He became the kind of story that coaches tell young players when they need to explain why effort matters more than talent, why presence matters more than perfection, why continuing to show up, even when showing up is the hardest thing in the world, is itself a form of genius. And what does his story mean for us? Because every story worth this much time has to mean something beyond the game. Jerome Bettis' life is a lesson in what it actually looks like to refuse to stop. Not in a motivational poster way. Not in a highlight reel way. In the real, unglamorous, exhausting, private daily way. The way that involves waking up and hurting and going anyway. The way that involves being told you are not enough and finding within yourself something that disagrees. The way that involves making the biggest mistake of your career in front of the entire country and still choosing to be present the next morning. We live in a world that celebrates the outcome but rarely examines the interior cost. We see the Super Bowl ring, but not the childhood asthma attacks. We see the Pro Bowl selections, but not the mornings where getting out of bed was the first act of courage in a day full of them. We see the Hall of Fame bust, but not the trade that felt like a confirmation of every fear a man had carried his whole life. Jerome Bettis showed us what is on the other side of all of that invisible suffering. And the answer is not that the suffering disappears. It is that the suffering becomes the foundation. The thing you build your whole life on, not in spite of what it cost you, but because of it. Because when you have learned to breathe through the worst, nothing on a football field is going to stop you. When you have lived with the possibility of your own body failing you since childhood, a fumble in a playoff game is devastating, yes, but it is not the end, because you already know how to get up from worse. That is the legacy of Jerome Bettis. Not the yards, not the rings, the getting up, the always, without exception, always getting up. And as you move through your own life, whatever field you are playing on, whatever opposition you face, whatever invisible condition follows you around telling you that you are not built for this, that you are not fast enough, not the right type, not what they are looking for. Remember that Jerome Bettis heard all of that too. And he ran anyway. Not fast, not perfectly, but forward, always forward, and the bus never stopped.